on the half-truth of belonging. What a powerful moment and conversation this will be. I want to take a moment just to introduce, we have a guest today, which is amazing. For the first time in the WiLD Conversation, we're going to have a conversation we're going to get a chance to watch. And one of the powers of this is just to just see and to hear some great thinking on this concept of belonging. And then we'll get a chance to talk about it in just a moment. I want to introduce our guests. Two of our guests are going to be having the conversation. One, this is our friend, Dr. Arthur Satterwhite. And Dr. Satterwhite is the Vice President for Diversity, Belonging, and Strategy at Young Life, an awesome organization that many of us have connections into. I know that I have deep roots there and deep friendships there. And so we're so excited to hear from him. And Arthur, I just love your title. It's awesome. And then we also have Dr. Daniel Halleck, who is the Chief Commercial Officer for WiLD Leaders. And Daniel is excited for this conversation. Daniel and Arthur, it's going to be amazing to have this. So we're just grateful that both of you are here. And so everybody brace yourselves, put on your seatbelts, and get ready for a conversation. Be thinking about what this spurs on for you. So y'all take it away.
Hey, thank you, Dr. McKenna and Dr. Satterwhite III. It is so good to be with you, Arthur. Thank you for joining us today. I'm excited about this topic because when I think of the half-truth of belonging, you know, when I dig it a little bit deeper into the belonging research and literature, it really is a whole topic. And I think so often there's so much nuance to it, but we often trivialize it to a meme where it's that leadership meme that just says, everyone should belong. And it's like, yeah, but then we don't actually talk about how to do that. So today, I mean, you and I have talked, we're not debunking this topic. We both believe in it, but we're hoping to get a little bit deeper below the surface than just the leadership meme. And I've loved connecting with you. When we met at a leadership conference a couple of years ago, just felt that kindred spirit right away. You're a thoughtful, nuanced person who has really interesting perspectives on belonging, diversity, inclusion, equity, and just some of the, I think, potentials and possibilities that can come in this space. So as we get in, the first thing I'm curious about, you teased us a little bit earlier this morning as we were prepping for this call, talking about what does it actually mean to belong? And so I'd love to have you start there. What does it mean to belong? And why does this topic matter for you personally and today?
Sure. And first, let me just say it's, my privilege being here with you all. You, Dr. Roberts, I want to say thank you for the invitation, especially to be a part of this conversation, one that is personal and I think is maybe one of the most important. We're living at an interesting point in history in our society. If you watch the news, doesn't matter what end of the spectrum you're on, we're amidst all this chaos. And I would say for me personally, in this conversation, I feel like my journey, my professional, ministerial, just my personal journey is just that question. It's like, hey, do I belong here? Do I fit here? I think that's a lot of what people, even maybe on this call, are feeling, whether it's in their workplace, in their community, maybe even in their home. It's just like, man, do I belong? Like, what does that mean? What does that look like? I'd point us back to a dear friend of Young Life, Dr. Eric Carter out of Vanderbilt, who's been doing some research, actually coming out of the disability community. This idea that belonging, different than inclusion, is maybe a next step. Right? Diversity, equity, and inclusion are something that are a hot topic right now. Companies, individuals are having this question like, man, what does it look like to be more diverse, to be agents of equity, to be intentional around even making sure people who have been excluded historically are included, where Dr. Carter and us as an organization are, is like, man, we feel like that next step of going to a place of belonging, where people feel not just part of, but they feel like they actually belong, that they are loved, that they're not just invited or welcomed, but we go the full way to, hey, you belong here in your full self. You can bring all that you are, all that you have, all that you're gifted in, and it makes sense here. I loved how Dr. Carter put it. He's like, hey, you belong when you're missed. When you're not there, you're not in the room, you're not in the meeting, you're not in the space. You belong when you're missed. and people are reaching out afterwards like, hey, we missed you. Why aren't you here? Again, that's just a little bit different than inclusion, where yes, it also requires intentionality, but I feel like where DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, often stop, especially in a professional context, is do we have more people around the table who typically aren't here? Have we thought about maybe some of our systems and processes so that we can make sure that they can be here? And are we intentional about making sure that their voice is heard? They're all right, all necessary. But again, belonging, I think, calls us to the next space. How do we need to change? How does this, whatever it is, need to change so that they fully belong and know that they are a full member of this? So just some thoughts.
I love that piece about feeling missed too. I mean, that it gets at one of I think our core psychological needs to be accepted, to be in relationship, to be part of a community of people. I just think of you and your job title, right? When I look at Vice President for Diversity, Belonging, and Strategy, with that backdrop you just shared around diversity, equity, inclusion as part of the way, but belonging is a different next level. I kind of imagine this Dilbert comic strip, right? And it's got the boss, and his thing is like, well, of course people feel like they belong here. We've got a vice president for diversity, belonging, and strategy.
Sure.
So I guess, and obviously that's kind of that memeified. We're not quite there. What for you with that job title and just your passion and background and expertise in this area, what's the greatest opportunity and the greatest challenge you face doing this work, even coming at it with belonging as part of your job title?
Sure. Maybe let me start with the back end of that. My greatest caution, and not even just to my organization, but to other organizations who are thinking about what role, who is going to give intentional thought to driving this really change process for an organization, right? It's not just a checklist. Okay, cool. We had some policies in place, got some new people here. Check the box. We're more diverse, more equitable, more inclusive. Who's going to drive that change process? It's so easy when we approach it from that checklist perspective for us to outsource that. Oh, that role is going to do this. And not realizing that, no, this is something that I, as a leader, and wherever you sit in the organization, you have a role to play. You're an agent of whether or not people belong in your context. We had a speaker join us as an organization just the other week, where she said, hey, this is courageous work. Courageous leaders create belonging. And realizing that it's not up to one person, it's a collective effort. I will say, and this is a shout out, kudos to my organization, but to other organizations who are doing it. For those who are creating this role, it gives me hope. You're putting skin in the game. You're putting stuff on the line because you're reallocating resources, human and financial, because you realize this is going to take something. It's going to require something, a sacrifice, there's a cost to it. Because to become that belonging space, it actually flies in the face of what we are most comfortable with, right? Because for someone else to belong, it might require something of me. I might need to give something up. I might need to be a little bit uncomfortable to ensure that somebody else who didn't belong actually does. And for those who get that, who are making that investment, I think that's so important. I'll just give you a story, because you had asked even just in the first question, talk about maybe a time that you didn't belong. I'll never forget, it was my first job, and this moment, this experience was so formative just on me as a leader. I was new, working in Manhattan in real estate, straight out of college, just cutting my teeth, young Black man in this corporate environment, and I was doing some pretty fun, good things. Some folks had taken notice, and I'll never forget. I still look up to this gentleman a day. It was my first boss. Called me into his office one day, and I didn't think anything of it because he was mentoring me, coaching me. We sit down where we have a little banter like normal, and then about halfway into the conversation, he's like, "Hey, I felt like I needed to say this. We don't do that here." And I was a little caught off guard, and I was just like, "What? We don't do what? What are you talking about? I need some context. Help me." And he said, "Hey, I've noticed you started to grow your hair out. I just wanted to let you know, if you want to grow in this organization, we prefer a more professional look. Let me give you some context. I used to have braids in college. And when I left college, was about to start working in the city, I was like, man, I just need a new look. I just need something fresh. I'm starting out. Let me just shave them off. About 6 months, 8 months on the job, I started to grow my hair back out because I was like, I miss my braids. That was a part of my identity. It was a part of me. So when he said, we don't do that here, to him, it wasn't a big thing. He was just coaching, trying to help me fit in. And they wanted to see me succeed. But what he unconsciously said to me was like, hey, that part of you doesn't belong here. So if you want to fit, then you need to assimilate, you need to adapt, you need to leave part of you at the door so that you can be part of this. And I think there's so many ways that unconsciously, unintentionally, our organizations, even us individually, we send those same messages to different people. Because there is dominant culture in all of our space. And I believe, especially in this context of belonging, our role as leaders to be those courageous leaders that it was Dr. Edmondson, just to give honor where honor is due, to be those courageous leaders, it requires us to get out of ourselves, get out of our own space, and to be more intentional about looking for those others who may not belong, or at least may not belong fully.
Man, and that's such a powerful, salient story that describes it. I also appreciate, Arthur, your grace in calling out the thing that made you feel like a part of you didn't belong without throwing him under the bus. You still honored him as a leader who had right intent, but the impact wasn't there as planned. You said a couple times something that fascinates me. You talk about we all have a role to play, or as a leaders, what's your role? And it's interesting because in that context, I'm thinking of what that individual might not have realized the role he could have played. There's a tension, I think that comes up. It's the responsibility of belonging. How much of it is my responsibility or your responsibility? How much of it is the organization, right? So sure. the tension of, and then what is the role of a leader in that piece? So the individual versus the corporate. How do you reconcile those two together? And then what is the individual leader in your perspective?
Yeah. Again, that comes back to my caution, right? It's easy for us, and we just naturally do this. If you're new to a job, right? You're coming in, you're trying to figure it all out. Where do I fit? Where do I belong? What is the culture, right? The unspoken around here. So there's the organizational piece around the organization has a responsibility to be intentional about being self-aware, being intentional about assessing itself. What is in place, policy, structures, etc., that may unintentionally, unconsciously say to some in its midst, those marginal people within its organization, you don't belong here, or at least not fully. You got to be a certain way, show up a certain way, do something a certain way to fully belong, and that's on leadership. And that's at the top, to hopefully have that self-awareness and intentionality. But if we succumb to the idea, well, that's on them to fix, not realizing that we have a role to play. It doesn't matter if you are the secretary up to the vice president. Each of you has a role to play in shaping that culture, in sending that message. And that's where the courageous part of that comes in. Because to be courageous is to call out sometimes people and organizations that are maybe not aware, that may be missing it. To call out those things that, hey, that's not right. That said to this person over here that they didn't belong, that they didn't fully fit, that they had to change who they were, show up in a different way. That's our personal agency, and because it's a change process, that's why everybody needs to show up in it, and everybody needs to own their own role in it. Again, not to take the pressure off the senior leadership. Hey, we, myself included, as an executive at Young Life, we have to lead from the top and shaping that, speaking into it, creating those accountability opportunities, metrics, measures, being transparent in it so that others fully sense and understand what is it. But again, it's about people taking ownership at whatever space they're in to help drive that too.
Yeah, no, I love that. There's a both and piece to that as well. You said something to earlier with us, and we had a conversation about a couple months ago as well, that you just alluded to a bit ago, which was, so often in this belonging space, we, whether it's policies or procedures, that top-down piece or the bottom-up, the individual responsibility, we're often looking at how do we include people who, or how do we be part of the journey of creating a place where people can belong who might not have normally felt that. And I like how you put it, the loudest voice in that conversation today is around race, but you also mentioned earlier disability. There's so many other pieces, pieces to this. One of the things that you mentioned earlier was that, with a dominant or majority culture, as there's often can be a fear of, okay, I've recognized that some might not belong, who I've maybe overlooked unintentionally. So I think of your old boss today, might be like, wow, that was a misstep.
Yeah.
You have a conversation, but now he's got a different perspective. But as you said, things are seismic. You used the word chaos. Things are changing so much. What does it look like for individuals who might be on the fringe, to use that terminology you used, or who might be in the dominant majority culture? What does belonging look like for them, and how do they think about themselves as the tectonic shifts are seismically shifting?
Yeah. There's so much in that question. It's a few things, and hopefully this comes out in a coherent way. Yes, race and ethnicity is like the loudest conversation, and rightly so. Like, there's centuries of history just in our American context of how, people of color, and specifically Black people, have been marginal in American society. And you see the protest and the unrest and everything, where you have these marginal people groups, and again, Black people in particular, saying, enough, we're tired. We're done with this gradualism that's at the pace of comfort for a dominant culture. We're enough. And this is why I think belonging is so powerful. Because again, at the heart of it is that cost, that sacrifice to ensure that others belong. It requires those who are in power to be self-aware enough, to be self-conscious enough to say, how do I give this away? How do I ensure that those who don't have, who are on the margins, are brought to the center and come? But in that same context, because of course, I would suggest, and I can't even take full credit for this. Another dear friend of mine, Dr. Greg Thompson, shared this with me years ago. The anger, the frustration that we hear, especially from a lot of our dominant culture friends, our whites, our male friends, it's at that, it comes more out of a place of fear and loss, because in this writing of creating spaces for belonging, that sacrifice, that loss is something that's real and felt. It's a loss of power. It's a loss of privilege. It's a loss of these things that, again, has just become norm. And we got to acknowledge that, because to just replace one power with another power is also not creating belonging. It's just shifting oppression. So how do we create a space where, yes, people of color, you need to be brought center. We need to create more diverse, equitable, inclusive, belonging spaces so that you can come fully as you are, fully belong, influence, shape, and form. But also to our white friends, you belong here too. You have a role in this too. No one's asking you to leave part of yourself at home either. And that's the tension of the both ends. And why this is so hard and requires courage. It's I think the perfect metaphor is a marriage, right? When you come to a marriage, it's two individual people who have their own way of doing things, and it's so easy to fall into, I hate to call it, a more traditional model, where that person, usually the male in the relationship, according to history, they're in control. They're the head, right? And I know the metaphor, they're the head, but they're the neck. But again, it's the idea of like, hey, for a marriage to truly work, as I've heard it, as counselors point to it, hey, it's that compromise. It's that coming together, that sacrifice, that, I'm going to, make room for my wife to fully be all that she is and who she is in our marriage, because that's right and that's good and that's healthy and I love her. And vice versa, the same thing for her. And that's to me the picture of when we think about belonging, even in our professional context. That's what we're trying to strive for. Is hey, how do I not let whatever it is I have as maybe a dominant cultural person, how do I not let that unconsciously, unintentionally perpetuate whatever oppression there may be? And I'll use myself as an example. I have privilege. I'm an executive in a global organization with a $500 million a year budget. I've got some power, some privilege, some position over other people. And if I'm not intentional about how I show up in a space, what I'm saying in that space, I can easily, unintentionally push somebody else to the margin, minimize what they can or how they show up in that space. And to me, where belonging is done well, when I'm a good agent of belonging, it's, hey, how am I giving that power and that privilege away? How am I bringing somebody else from the margin who wouldn't have access, who wouldn't have had a platform? How am I centering them? Because now I just created a space where I said, hey, Daniel, you belong here. Your voice matters. If you weren't here right now, I would miss you. I need you to show up too. And I think that's the idea here with belonging. How can we, as people, wherever we are, with whatever we have, show up and be that? And that doesn't mean I've got to stop being who I am and leave part of me home. That means I just got to make room for somebody else to be there too.
Man, Arthur, this is blowing my mind. I haven't read the chat, but I see it's blowing up. I've got dozens more questions I can ask you. I'm gonna ask you one more because in many ways we're just barely opening the door on this. It's like we just got peeked in a crack, right?
Sure.
There's so much more to get into. And the last question I'm curious about before we get into these breakouts and debrief a little bit is when it comes to this whole space and being on that journey yourself, what is your edge for belonging? What are you still trying to figure out and wrestle through for your own development as a leader who even has belonging in this title? Yeah.
I mean, it was a big question. I'll say this because I've said it in a few other places. Realizing that I'm a practitioner in this, but I'm also a person. And I've used this in a few contexts. Hey, this work is simultaneously soul-sucking and satisfying. Is how I framed it. It's soul-sucking because you're called to step into hurt, into pain, into uncomfort, discomfort, into brokenness, and that's hard. It's satisfying in those moments where you can be a bridge. You can be an agent of healing, of restoration, of not to use all Christianese language, but redemption. To be able to step into that. My edge, I would say, is that I'm human, that I have blind spots and I have unconscious bias that causes me to miss it. I'm not perfect. I'm not an expert in belonging, even as I'm growing in it and learning along the way. This is why I've loved our friendship, Daniel, because we challenge each other, we push each other, we speak into each other. Belonging isn't just about race and ethnicity. It's about gender. It's about age and generations. It's about abilities. Again, there's so many different lenses through which we can begin to see others who we wouldn't traditionally normally see. And I don't always have those lenses in place. And sometimes I got to be corrected. I was leading an event a year or so ago, and as I set up the panel, I unconsciously did this. I had all the men on one side and the one woman that was on the panel on the other side. And to me, I was just like, I just want to be in the middle and for everybody to connect and feel like I'm not just out of the thing. And I had to stop the panel after about 3 minutes when all of a sudden I was just like, wait a second, something's off here. I didn't, the way I set this up, let her set her up to belong in this. And it's are we self-aware enough? Do we have the emotional intelligence enough? Not that don't have some emotional intelligence gaps either, to realize it and to own it, because that's how we get better at being about advancing, being agents of reconciliation and belonging in our context.
Man, Arthur, I love it. You've just blown my mind. I'm excited to read the chat in a moment, and we're going to get folks in the breakout. So,
What would you say?
Yeah, I mean, there's hope. Maybe that's because my number 5 in Strength Finders is positivity, so I tend to be the eternal optimist. But my hope is that because belonging, it's on all of us. And as long as we continue to show up in our space and be that agent, that courageous leader, then it is possible. It's when we give up or we outsource it or we're not intentional about it that hope starts to dwindle. So all of you here, part of this conversation is hope for me. And my prayer is that you don't grow weary, not to get all biblical on you, in your well-doing as you go back into your space.
That's a good word. There's hope.